The morning of the product launch should have been the proudest moment of my career. For 18 months, I had lived and breathed that project. I missed birthdays, canceled vacations, and spent countless nights in empty conference rooms making sure every deadline was met. Yet when I walked into the company auditorium and saw the giant presentation screen, my stomach dropped. My name was gone. Not moved. Not shortened. Completely erased. In its place was the name of my department director, Ethan Caldwell, the same man who had barely attended project meetings and spent most of the year traveling to conferences. Around me, coworkers applauded the launch announcement while I sat frozen in my seat, staring at the slide that had just rewritten history. I wanted to stand up. I wanted to defend myself. Instead, I stayed silent. Because 3 weeks earlier, while organizing archived files, I had found something strange buried inside an old email chain. At the time, I wasn't sure it mattered. Now I wasn't so certain. What nobody in that room knew, including Ethan, was that the company owner, a man who rarely attended internal events, had unexpectedly decided to join the launch ceremony that morning. And before the celebration ended, he would open one forgotten email that would change everything. For most of my 8 years at Harrison Dynamics, I believed hard work eventually spoke for itself. I wasn't the loudest employee, the most politically connected, or the person who knew how to turn every meeting into a performance. I simply focused on results. When our company began losing market share to larger competitors, the owner announced a company-wide initiative to develop a new logistics platform that could transform how our clients managed nationwide distribution. It was an ambitious project with a brutal timeline, and most department heads quietly hoped someone else would volunteer to lead it. I did. At the time, I thought it was an opportunity. Looking back, it was also a test. The first 6 months were exhausting. We dealt with software failures, budget restrictions, staffing shortages, and clients who constantly changed requirements. More than once, senior leadership suggested scaling back features to meet deadlines, but I kept finding solutions because I genuinely believed in what we were building. Ethan Caldwell became my direct supervisor halfway through the project after a restructuring. At first, he seemed supportive. He complimented my work in meetings, praised my leadership, and often told executives that the project was making remarkable progress. But slowly, something changed. During presentations, he began speaking as though decisions I had made were his own. Client recommendations I had developed suddenly appeared in reports under his name. When executives asked technical questions, he answered them using information I had provided hours earlier. I noticed it, but I convinced myself it wasn't intentional. I told myself we were all working toward the same goal. Then one afternoon, while preparing materials for a quarterly review, I received a presentation draft from Ethan's assistant by mistake. My name wasn't listed anywhere. The project leadership section showed Ethan as the architect of the initiative. Every major milestone was credited to him. At first I assumed it was an error, but when I politely pointed it out, he smiled and said something that stayed with me for months. Titles matter at the executive level, Claire. Don't take it personally. I remember driving home that night with the radio off, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my hands hurt. The project had become my life, yet somehow I was being erased from it piece by piece. Still, I stayed quiet because I needed the job. My mother was recovering from surgery, and I couldn't afford a confrontation that might jeopardize my position. Instead, I focused on finishing the platform. What I didn't know was that Ethan wasn't simply taking credit. He was preparing to take everything. 3 weeks before launch day, rumors began circulating that a major promotion would accompany the project's success. Everyone assumed the position would go to whoever led the initiative. Friends inside other departments quietly congratulated me in advance. Then the executive announcement arrived. Ethan had been selected for the promotion. The email described him as the visionary leader behind the company's most important innovation in a decade. My name appeared once in a list of 32 team members. That was it. No recognition. No acknowledgement. Nothing. The betrayal hurt more than I expected. Not because of the title itself, but because of what it represented. Every late night, every sacrifice, every problem solved had been handed to someone else. Yet while most people would have confronted him immediately, I did something different. I went back through 18 months of project files, meeting records, archived communications, and development notes. I wasn't looking for revenge. I was looking for peace of mind. I needed proof that I wasn't imagining what had happened. That's when I discovered the forgotten email buried deep inside an archive folder that nobody had opened in more than a year. The moment I read it, my pulse quickened. Because suddenly, the entire story looked very different. The email had been sent 16 months earlier, near the beginning of the project, when the company owner, Richard Harrison, was still personally reviewing development proposals before stepping back from daily operations. At first glance it seemed ordinary, a short message attached to an internal planning discussion, but the deeper I looked, the more important it became. The original chain contained detailed recommendations I had written outlining the exact framework that eventually became the backbone of the platform. Every major feature, every implementation strategy, every projected revenue benefit that leadership now praised had been documented there long before Ethan ever joined the department. What caught my attention wasn't my contribution itself, it was Richard's response. He had personally replied to the thread, praising the proposal and instructing leadership to preserve the original authorship because future performance evaluations and promotion decisions should reflect who actually developed the initiative. Attached to the message was a directive sent to multiple executives, including Ethan after he joined the project months later. Somehow, despite those instructions, the official narrative had gradually changed. The more records I reviewed, the clearer the pattern became. Meeting summaries had been rewritten. Presentation decks had been modified. Internal reports slowly shifted language from Claire's initiative to leadership initiative and eventually to Ethan's strategic vision. None of the changes seemed dramatic individually, but together they created a completely different history. I considered forwarding the evidence to human resources or filing a formal complaint, but experience told me that would only create private discussions behind closed doors. Ethan had spent years building relationships with executives. I was respected, but I wasn't politically powerful. So I saved copies of everything and returned to work. Meanwhile, launch preparations accelerated. News about the platform spread throughout the industry. Several major clients confirmed long-term contracts based on the system's capabilities, and internal forecasts projected record revenue growth. Ethan became increasingly confident. He walked through the office like someone already celebrating a victory. He gave interviews to industry publications, attended executive dinners, and began referring to future leadership initiatives as if his promotion were already secured. The strange part was that he barely spoke to me anymore. Once he no longer needed my expertise, I became almost invisible. During one planning meeting, he publicly thanked everyone on the team except me. Several coworkers noticed the omission and exchanged uncomfortable glances, but nobody said anything. They understood the office hierarchy. Challenging Ethan carried risks. A week before launch, a colleague named Rachel quietly stopped by my desk after hours. She closed the door, sat across from me, and asked a simple question. "Are you really okay with what's happening?" I stared at my computer screen for several seconds before answering. "No," I admitted. But being angry doesn't change the facts. Rachel hesitated before revealing something that caught me off guard. Apparently several employees had privately discussed how much credit Ethan was taking. Some even knew I had built most of the project. The problem was that nobody believed anything could be done. Ethan was too established. Too protected. Too close to senior leadership. I thanked her for being honest and left it at that. What I didn't tell her was that I had already stopped worrying about convincing coworkers. My attention was focused on something else. 2 days earlier, I had learned that Richard Harrison would personally attend the launch ceremony after returning from an extended international trip. That detail changed everything. Richard rarely appeared at company events anymore. Most employees had never even met him. But unlike the executives who managed daily operations, he had been involved when the project first began. More importantly, he had written that forgotten email. The one document that connected every piece of the story. Even then, I wasn't expecting some dramatic public confrontation. I simply hoped the owner might recognize the truth if he ever reviewed the original records. What I didn't know was that circumstances were already moving in that direction. Because on the morning of the launch, only minutes before the presentation began, a technical issue forced the event team to access archived project files from the company's central server. And hidden among those files was an email chain that had been forgotten by everyone except me. By 9 o'clock that morning, the auditorium was packed with employees, clients, investors, and members of the press. Large screens displayed promotional videos celebrating the platform's launch while executives moved through the crowd shaking hands and accepting congratulations. I sat near the back with several team members, watching the presentation unfold exactly as I had feared. Slide after slide praised Ethan's leadership. A professionally produced video described the project as the result of his vision and strategic direction. Every time the audience applauded, I felt strangely detached, as though I were watching someone else's story being told. Then Richard Harrison arrived. The room immediately shifted. Conversations stopped. Executives straightened their posture. Even Ethan seemed slightly nervous as the 80-year-old founder took his seat in the front row. Richard wasn't known for dramatic speeches or public confrontations. He had built the company over 4 decades and earned a reputation for valuing facts over politics. When Ethan finally stepped onto the stage to deliver the keynote presentation, everything appeared to be going according to plan. He spoke confidently about innovation, leadership, and the future of the company. The audience responded enthusiastically. Then, halfway through the presentation, the projection system froze. At first it seemed like a minor technical problem. The screen flickered, several files closed unexpectedly, and the event coordinator hurried toward the control station. While technicians worked to restore the presentation, Richard calmly asked whether the original project archive was available so he could review some early development materials while everyone waited. Nobody thought much of the request. After all, he was the owner. Within moments, the archive appeared on the main screen. Hundreds of files filled the display. Meeting notes. Draft proposals. Planning documents. Archived communications. The technician began searching for an early roadmap when Richard suddenly leaned forward and pointed toward a folder. "Open that one," he said. My heartbeat instantly accelerated. I recognized the folder name. It was the archive containing the forgotten email chain. The technician clicked it open. Several messages appeared. Richard asked for the earliest correspondence. As the email expanded onto the giant screen, the room fell silent. I watched Ethan's expression change almost immediately. First confusion. Then concern. Then unmistakable panic. Richard adjusted his glasses and began reading aloud portions of the message. He read my original proposal. He read the strategic recommendations that became the foundation of the platform. Then he reached his own response from 16 months earlier. The room became so quiet that I could hear the hum of the projectors overhead. Richard slowly read the section instructing leadership to preserve authorship records and ensure future recognition reflected the actual creator of the initiative. He paused. Read it again. Then looked directly at Ethan. No one moved. No one spoke. For several long seconds, the founder simply stared at the executive standing on stage. Finally, he asked a question that would later be repeated throughout the company for years. If Claire Bennett created this platform, why has every presentation this morning described it as your work? The question landed like an explosion. Ethan attempted to answer. He talked about leadership responsibilities, team collaboration, and organizational structure, but every explanation sounded weaker than the one before it. Richard listened without interruption. Then he requested additional records. More files appeared. More documentation surfaced. Meeting notes. Development reports. Design approvals. One after another, they confirmed the same story. The deeper the review went, the harder it became to deny what had happened. And as hundreds of people watched from their seats, the narrative Ethan had spent more than a year constructing began collapsing in real time. The next 20 minutes felt unreal. Richard continued reviewing documents with the patience of someone who no longer needed to rush toward conclusions. Each new file added another layer of clarity. Internal approvals carried my name. Client feedback sessions listed me as the primary contact. Development milestones contained detailed notes I had personally written months before Ethan ever claimed ownership of the initiative. What made the situation impossible to explain away was the consistency of the evidence. There wasn't one document proving my involvement. There were hundreds. Every major decision left a trail, and that trail pointed in the same direction. Around the auditorium, people who had spent the morning applauding Ethan now sat in stunned silence. Several executives began quietly reviewing copies of reports on their tablets. Others exchanged uncomfortable looks as they realized they had accepted a false narrative without ever questioning it. Ethan's confidence completely disappeared. His voice lost its authority. His posture changed. The executive who had walked onto the stage expecting a career-defining victory now looked like someone desperately trying to escape a spotlight he had once enjoyed. Then Richard asked another question. Who approved the revisions removing Claire's authorship from official project records? Nobody answered immediately. The reason was simple: multiple departments had touched those documents over 18 months, but no one wanted to admit responsibility in front of clients, investors, and employees. Eventually, a vice president admitted that revisions had been made based on recommendations from Ethan's office. The moment those words were spoken, the room seemed to collectively understand what had happened. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't an administrative error. It was a deliberate effort to rewrite ownership of the company's most important project. Richard closed the file and stood from his seat. Despite his age, his presence commanded the entire room. He walked onto the stage, took the microphone, and looked directly at the audience. I built this company with one principle, he said. The people who do the work deserve the credit. Without that principle, nothing else matters. Then he turned toward me. For a second, I genuinely thought he was simply going to acknowledge my contribution and move on. Instead, he asked me to come to the stage. My legs felt weak as I walked down the aisle. Hundreds of eyes followed me. Employees. Executives. Investors. Journalists. People who had spent months believing Ethan's version of events. When I reached the stage, Richard handed me the microphone. Tell them how this platform was built, he said. I wasn't prepared for a speech. I hadn't spent months planning revenge. I hadn't rehearsed a moment of public vindication. So I simply told the truth. I spoke about the team members who worked late nights solving impossible problems. I described the setbacks we overcame. I thanked colleagues who had supported the project when success wasn't guaranteed. I never attacked Ethan. I never raised my voice. I never demanded recognition. Ironically, that made the contrast even stronger. The audience could see the difference between someone protecting an image and someone describing reality. When I finished, the applause began slowly. Then it grew louder. Then nearly everyone in the room stood. I remember looking across the audience and seeing Rachel wiping tears from her eyes. Several coworkers who had remained silent for months were smiling. Even some executives appeared relieved that the truth had finally surfaced. But the biggest surprise came afterward. During a private meeting immediately following the event, Richard informed the board that Ethan's promotion would be suspended pending a formal investigation into the manipulation of project records. Over the following weeks, additional findings emerged. The review uncovered multiple instances where contributions from employees had been reassigned to support executive advancement. The consequences were swift. Ethan resigned before the investigation concluded. Several leadership procedures were completely redesigned. Yet the most satisfying part wasn't what happened to him. It was what happened next. 3 months later, the platform exceeded every financial projection. New client contracts poured in. Revenue reached record levels. And during the company's annual leadership conference, Richard stood before the entire organization and announced the creation of a new executive role designed specifically to oversee future innovation initiatives. Then he smiled and read the name of the person selected to fill it. For the first time in my career, nobody had to wonder who earned the position. The room erupted in applause before Richard could even finish speaking. As I walked toward the stage, I noticed something that made me smile. The same giant screens that once displayed a rewritten version of history now carried a very different message. Across the center appeared a single line: "Leadership isn't about claiming success. It's about creating it." And for the first time in a very long time, the story on the screen matched the truth. A year later, people still talked about the launch day when a forgotten email changed everything. New employees heard the story during onboarding. Managers referenced it during leadership training. What surprised me most was that the moment itself wasn't what stayed with me. It wasn't Ethan's downfall, the investigation, or even my promotion. It was the lesson I learned while sitting silently in that auditorium, watching someone else take credit for my work. For a long time, I believed recognition came from working harder than everyone else. What I eventually discovered was that integrity leaves a trail. The truth may move slowly, but it has a way of surviving when ambition, politics, and manipulation eventually fall apart. The platform continued growing. The company expanded into new markets. My team received opportunities we once only dreamed about. And every major success felt more meaningful because it was built on honesty instead of image. As for Ethan, I never saw him again. I didn't need to. Karma had already done its work. The people who mattered knew the truth, and that truth opened doors no stolen title ever could. Sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't exposing someone. It's staying focused long enough to let their own choices expose them. If you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or watched someone else take credit for your efforts, remember this: your work matters, even when nobody seems to notice. And when the truth finally arrives, it doesn't need to shout. It speaks for itself. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your experience in the comments. I'd love to know, have you ever stayed silent while someone took credit for your work, and what happened when the truth finally came out?